Managed mentoring for getting started in beekeeping. This is Introduction to Hive Maladies. I am Kevin England. In this lesson, we will provide a high-level understanding of honeybee maladies. The lesson will give you an overview of honeybee immune defenses, colony defense mechanisms, as well as a run-through of diseases, conditions, disorders, and some other phenomena that impact honeybee health. At the end, we'll offer some resources for you to follow to learn more about the topic. And it's interesting to take a moment to note that we have not spent a lot of time talking about hive maladies so far in this courseware. Well, it's not out of the question that you might have problems related to hive maladies in your first year of operation, but it's more likely that you're going to get through the first year without any encounters of difficulty because first year colonies generally thrive very well, and they have a clean environment to do so. The impact of hive maladies often surface when problems occur in a second season and beyond. Many of the problems that beekeepers could encounter are quite rare, but you still need to know what they are in case some come calling. And so this lesson covers the basics, and we would highly recommend that you consider supplementing your knowledge by further study and securing a field guide to keep in your kit. We will recommend one at the end of the lesson plan. To start the discussion, one of the things to recognize is we are quite fortunate that our individual honeybees have developed a defense system over millennia. They are exposed to just about everything you can be exposed to on the exterior of a hive, and they have developed defenses for it. Their physical anatomy, the hemolymph, the immune system, the use of propolis, all of these things are used as the immune function and social behaviors development within the colony to provide defense against maladies. And much of what the bees do and how they operate have to do specifically with how they've learned over years to fight whatever it is they face in the outside world. As noted, the individual defense is impressive, but so is the superorganism. And as you take in the slide, you can see that there's some examples of the superorganism behavior that both the individual bee participates in and the colony at large. If a bee is sick, it is altruistic, which means it will not stay in and amongst its nestmates. It will fly off to perish somewhere where it cannot contaminate the interior of the hive. If something tries to get into the hive, they will mount a defense against that and prevent it from bringing anything unwanted to the interior. If a mouse gets in and dies within the hive, they coat it with propolis and entomb it so it cannot spread disease within inside the colony space. The use of propolis as a social behavior is amazing. They cover the outside and the entrance so that when bees land and go inside, they do not bring in anything that is microbial. The social defense is as impressive as the individual defense. As impressive as the immune and social capabilities are of the individual honeybee and the superorganism, their defense is not without gaps. Diseases, bacteria, viruses, syndromes are all constantly evolving and challenging a honeybee colony. And in this presentation, we're going to go through a number of them and tell you what they are and how they try to impact the honeybee colony that you're hosting. In the previous slide, we described a disease as a particular abnormal condition or disorder or structure or function that affects part or all of the organism. You see here two disease variations, bacterial and fungal. We're going to run through a couple of these. It's really kind of just a grounding. You don't need to know these in some sort of quiz manner, but it is clear to understand which is which so that when you are combating whatever it is that is affecting your bees, you understand the right approach. When you're trying to battle a bacterial disease versus a fungal disease, you're going to apply a different pathway to fix the problem. Beyond bacterial and fungal disease, you have protozoan and ectoparasite diseases. These are not the most common things, but when they do occur, you also need to understand what they are, how they work, and how to approach the problem to correct them should you encounter any difficulties from these form of diseases, which we'll run down in a moment. The last disease variation is viral diseases. These are very common in beekeeping operations. You have viruses inside your hive at all times, especially vectored by varroa mites. Beekeepers need to understand the different viruses that are there and how to recognize when they are present and understand the treatment pathways. To do justice to maladies of the hive, you would need an extensive course, multiple sessions. There's so much, as you'll see in the inventory of what I'm about to list, to know about. The good news is for beekeepers, we generally do not have to worry about all of these things. We have to pay attention to several key ones. American foul brood is the one that you must know the ins and outs of and be able to recognize and understand how to deal with it immediately. A couple others come to mind which are more common. Deformed wing virus, European foul brood, dealing with chalk brood, and other sub-level, medium level things are something that as a regular beekeeper you may or may not encounter. The point here is to say this is an introduction to these things, and I will point out as we can some that you should spend more time, but as a good beekeeper, it would be incumbent upon you to go look through a lot of this information and spend some time on the side doing some study of what it is. We'll start the inventory of discussion with honeybee diseases. Two categories we're going to give it: brood disease and adult bee disease. Brood disease impacts brood, and you can look for American foul brood, which is the one that really is detrimental to both your colony and anyone else's colonies. When this is found, it is a major thing to rectify. When you're looking for American foul brood, you'll hear the rope test, you'll hear how to identify how the honeycomb looks, meaning the brood comb. We're going to, like I said earlier, recommend a book which explains what it looks like, shows pictures, how to mitigate it, and so on. So in this introduction, we're not going to cover it. But I am going to emphasize the point that if you have American foul brood, this is a serious disease. Not very common, does occur in sporadic cases. You should know how to identify it and make sure that you mitigate it immediately. European foul brood is something that we see within beekeeper colonies in the mid-Atlantic region. Often it shows up with stress in beekeeping operations in the early spring where colonies start to expand and then a cold snap comes in and the colonies contract and the bees that were being reared get left because the colony has to come back together. Virus loads and other things result in European foul brood, and you will need to know what that is and how to mitigate it. Chalk brood, not something you're going to see, but on a rare occasion, stone brood, sac brood, not common whatsoever. The adult bee viruses, most of these will show up vectored by wounds from the varroa mite. All of these things listed here are rather rare. When you see deformed wing virus, though, that one where the bee comes out of the cell and the wings are shriveled, the bee will never fly and it's crawling around. You'll find them on the comb, you'll find them falling off the front entrance and crawling around in the grass. This is a sign of a late infestation of varroa mites, and it is pretty common. Other late signs are chronic paralysis and Israeli acute viruses. The paralysis viruses, you see the bees kind of trembling on the comb. If you have a massive infection, you might see this in your apiary. Again, look at the book that we're going to recommend and read through the descriptions. And anytime you're looking through a colony, look to see if something looks unusual in the way that the bees are behaving. Two other classifications of maladies that could occur to honeybee colonies include conditions and syndromes phenomena. Conditions are something that you probably will encounter over your span of keeping bees. Cold temperatures, starvation, dysentery or spotting from gastric distress, and everybody encounters robbing at some point in their beekeeping time frame. Laying workers is not something you see until you're in usually for a couple years, depending on how good your queen is mated. If a queen stops laying fertilized eggs or is challenged, the workers may develop their ovaries, but they're not fertilized, and that is a challenge in itself. Syndromes and phenomena, they're kind of a catch-all. Parasitic mite syndrome is all of the impacts that occur when the viruses and the mite wounds and other things that occur to the honeybee colony manifest. Honeybee syndrome we'll cover in a moment. Colony collapse disorder was a condition that was called out as bees absconding, leaving a perfectly healthy colony for no particular reason. It was sensationalized for a long period of time, but never really classified fully as something that people understood what it was. And there's question as to whether it was a combination of different syndromes and conditions or whether it really was a thing. Jury's still out on that. Absconding is something, a phenomena that happens if there's a lot of pressure, stress, or problems within the colony itself, meaning the condition and environment that causes the bees to leave. These are all maladies of honeybee colonies. Well, I talked about CCD briefly on the previous slide. It does deserve a special call out from a malady standpoint. It's rather ambiguous these days if you ask people what it actually is, but it was something that was discovered in Pennsylvania in 2006, and given the moniker of colony collapse disorder, the background to it is the entire colony collapses. It either leaves, and it leaves behind what was a fully functioning colony, or it perishes outright. You still hear reports, occasionally of this condition occurring, but it was never really well understood. And there's a lot of theories as to what it was, and the jury's still out. Not sure if this is a thing in these days, but it is still reported periodically. Honeybee syndrome is something that's been out there for 100+ years. Bees getting into a certain kind of sugar that is toxic to them has been deemed as honeybee syndrome. This is manna trees, most common occurrence. We don't have them in the United States, but certain fruits, vegetables, plants have mannose sugar, and if bees were exposed to them, it can be toxic to them. When we looked at the list of viruses, deformed wing virus and Israeli acute paralysis virus and so on, these lists are somewhere in the 24 range at this point, and they come from varroa mites. If in time varroa impact the colony and the distribution of these viruses overwhelms the colony collapses. Not the same as colony collapse disorder, but parasitic mite syndrome is just a takedown of a colony because of the virus load vectored by varroa mites. And at times when the pressures get so high, the colony will abscond. If you see your colony degrading in manner where the larva is unhealthy, the brood patterns look terrible, the bees are distributed with different diseases like deformed wing virus and paralysis viruses, it is highly likely that that's a conglomeration of varroa mite viruses, and often this is referred to as parasitic mite syndrome. If you reviewed the Dead Out series, you know that there's a couple of things that can happen to honeybees as they are confined for a long period of time. Dysentery, gastric distress, consuming bad foods, and other things can lead to problems and maladies for the bees. These again are not very common if you do proper management techniques, but occasionally, just from conditions, maybe the bees got high ash content nectar that they converted and then encountered a long winter, that could lead to problems and maladies appearing as spring approaches or the literal downfall of your hive. Well, this is an introduction to maladies. One specific malady, American foulbrood, requires some special attention. This is the most serious of all the diseases of honeybees, and you, even as a beginner, should really understand what this disease is, how it impacts the bees, and in addition to that, how to identify it and to notify immediately your state organization, your local organization, if you suspect that you have American foulbrood. It starts with a spore that can be widely distributed by the bees, and it is one of the reasons why you should be really careful about using old equipment, as the spore can last for decades. American foulbrood is a brood disease. It is not something that impacts adults. So if you're trying to identify American foulbrood, you would read the brood pattern and see the information available on the slide here. Primarily what happens, and one of the things that you should be aware of, is that the brood dies right after it's capped, and the decay and decline of the brood underneath causes a wet condition inside the cell, and that reverses the typical dome that you see over a honeybee capped in development and makes it convex. It gives it a greasy looking appearance, and if you poked and prodded into that larva, you would find that it's decayed and it would have an off color appearance. Two secondary late stage symptoms that you might find. One is pupal tongue. As the bees start to perish from the disease, some of the developing larva never gets capped and it dies in the open cell, and you might find that as part of their starvation they stick their tongue out and it will be stuck to the inside of the cell. The second thing is an odor. It's described sometimes as a rotten egg or dead fish kind of smell. If you smell anything off when you open your hive and look through and match that up to the comb patterns that were described in the previous slide, you should really consider doing some testing to see whether or not you have American foulbrood. One common field test that you'll often hear about when trying to determine whether your hive has AFB is called the rope test. You would take a stick or a toothpick or something that you can poke through the capping into the cell and swirl it around in what remains of the larva that was in development. When you pull it through, it will rope out. And sorry to be descriptive, but this is done this way so that you remember it. It looks like snot being pulled in a long string. If you find that condition, that is an indicator that you may potentially have American foulbrood, as AFB is one of the only things that does that rope behavior. Now, there's another thing that you should know about, just as information. There is a proper test kit that you can buy and keep in your beekeeping kit called a milk test, that you could take a sample, put it in, and it will determine whether you do or don't have American foulbrood. Again, if you suspect that you have it, this is a serious disease and you should contact your state apiarist. We've provided a link to the Dice Lab for Honeybees video on American foulbrood. We highly suggest that you take the time and go view that video, as it has a more comprehensive background for you on understanding the background on AFB, how to identify it, and how to remediate it. As an introduction, this was meant to be just kind of a quick run through of things that are out there. But the prevalence of these diseases, some that I haven't even shown you, are just not there for you to worry about. Again, it's interesting as a beekeeper to know what's out there, and you may have a super rare encounter with some of them. The most common diseases found in the United States as listed by experts are shown on the slide. In my experience, American foul brood is not something that almost all beekeepers see in their lifetime, while European foul brood is actually pretty common. Sac brood, never seen it. It says that it's common, but not as far as I know in the mid-Atlantic region. Chalk brood you will encounter on occasion. You would see white mummified corpses at the front entrance, and sometimes you'll see them in the comb. Not something that is that hard to overcome. There's a state called nosema, which is prevalent, but you can't see it in the bees. It's a sporidion in the gut of the bees, and yes, bees do suffer from nosema, especially in specific areas of the region. That's one that you might want to spend a little more time looking into. It's a good time to remind you that 99% of the time when you operate a colony, it's working perfectly fine. And that provides you a perfect opportunity to look at the bees. Look at the bees in development. Understand how the life cycle works from egg all the way through to larva, pupa, and emergence. Look at the young bees as they emerge, and look at the adults as they get to foraging age and they have tattered wings. If you understand what good looks like by watching routine, everyday, normal behavior of a healthy colony, then anytime something shows up that looks a little bit off, you're going to spot it pretty quickly. It's a key reminder that the best way to understand diseases is to look at what good looks like, and then you'll be able to recognize anything that seems off. Spending a moment to be more specific, two of the key areas you need to look at are the individual bees themselves. Look at the health of the bees, the color of the bees, their hair, their wings, their operation, how they walk on the comb. Additionally, look at the brood comb. Look at the brood cappings. Look at the bees in development. Look at the royal jelly in the bottom when a larva is trying to grow to become a pupa and get capped. These are key things that you should be looking at as you pull frames. And every single time you see a patch of brood, find brood in all stages and look at its development. This is where you're going to spot disease. Make sure you're key to those two things, and you really should be in good shape for making sure that anything that's occurring in your colony doesn't get out of control. By way of introduction, we feel like this is one of the most useful guides that you can have for introduction and management of hive maladies. This Penn State guide costs a little bit of money, but it's one that we have in our kits personally. If you find something out in the field, you can go into your kit and get this small booklet out, open the page, and read through the information and get the on-the-spot guidance of what you should be doing, how to identify different problems that you might see. You can scan the link or visit the web page, and there's additional resources out on the internet that help you identify, learn, and manage for disease. Bee Informed Partnership, Honeybee Health Coalition, and others come to mind. This concludes the lesson for Introduction to Hive Maladies. The next bunch of lessons are a series on swarm management, the natural reproduction of a honeybee colony. We'll talk about swarm basics, indicators, triggers, and we'll give you guidance on swarm management. If you have questions about this presentation or any of the presentations, you can ask at our next online session. You can also send an email to the address on the slide. If you're watching from YouTube, you can leave a comment below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you at the next lesson.